Welcome back, or welcome for the first time, to Lady Mythos. Tonight, we travel to a world where winter ruled without mercy. A world where the sun slipped away for weeks at a time, and families gathered in silence, hoping their fires and their luck would hold. This was Yule, the ancient Norse Yule. Long before Christmas lights and familiar traditions, there was only darkness, discipline, and the understanding that one mistake could cost dearly. In those nights, people spoke of many things, of ancestors watching, of rituals that must be kept, of forces that walked the snow-covered fields when humans slept. But among all these stories, one figure stood apart. Not a god, though bound to one. Not a mere spirit, though feared like one. A visitor, a judge, a protector. A reminder of what the cold season demanded. This was the Yule Goat, the Julbock. His roots reach back to the oldest Norse beliefs, to the thunder god Thor and the two goats who pulled his chariot across stormy skies. They were creatures of strength, sacrifice, and renewal, fitted perfectly for a world where survival depended on all three. Their story, preserved in the Prose Edda, would shape centuries of winter tradition. And then came Loki, whose single act during a winter journey changed the fate of those goats forever and set the foundation for the Yule Goat we know today. Across time, the Julbock would become a masked visitor pounding on doors, a straw guardian hanging by the hearth, and even a bringer of gifts long before Santa Claus arrived in the north. But before any of that could happen, there was the world that created him. A world of cold, risk, and ritual, where people relied on both gods and their own skill to make it through the darkest season. That is where our story begins. And before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and tap the little bell. It helps this little corner of myth and history reach the people who love it most. Now, settle in. Chapter 1. Yule before Christmas. Winter Rituals of the Norse North. Before the Yule Goat became a visitor who might knock on a door or appear as a straw figure hanging by a hearth, Yule itself held a central role in Norse life. Yule was not a single night, but a broad midwinter period marked by gatherings, sacrifices, and the acknowledgement of ancestors. It was documented in medieval sources, including the writings of Snorri Sturluson and early Christian observers describing the traditions of the North. Yule came at the darkest point of the year. In rural Scandinavian settlements, daylight in deep winter could shrink to only a few hours. The threat of hunger was real, and storms could isolate farms for days at a time. People depended on livestock, preserved food, and the support of their kin. Yule was the moment to take stock of these resources and to give thanks for survival so far. Historically, Yule celebrations included blót, or sacrificial rituals, honoring gods and ancestors. These were not decorative ceremonies, but practical acts meant to secure good fortune. Animal sacrifices fed communities, and the shared meal reinforced social bonds. Drinking customs during Yule were also recorded in medieval texts, especially the idea of making formal toasts. one to the gods, one to the ancestors, and one to the king or local chieftain. Fires were kept burning continuously, especially in households that still followed older customs. Light was more than comfort. It symbolized continuity. The fear of the dark was not unreasonable. Food stores could spoil, predators could approach, and illness spread easily when cold confined people indoors. As part of the season, families prepared their homes carefully. Tools were repaired, livestock was checked, grain stores were measured. This was a time for caution and discipline, but also a time for ritual behavior meant to secure safety through the long stretch of winter still ahead. It is in this environment, one that valued both physical preparation and spiritual protection, that the figure of the goat began to emerge with significance. Goats were not unusual animals in Norse farms. They provided milk, hair, meat, and hides. Their hardiness made them valuable during harsh climates. But the symbolic importance did not come from their everyday use. It came from their association with a particular deity, and a myth that would place goats at the center of a story about resilience, risk, and the consequences of breaking taboo. This early chapter of Yule sets the foundation for understanding why a goat, out of all animals, took on a ritual role in the midwinter imagination. The connection becomes clearer once we turn to Thor's travels and the goats that pulled his chariot. These goats were not ordinary livestock. They represented a cycle of life, death, and renewal that perfectly matched the concerns of people facing the longest nights of the year. The Yule Goat's link to Thor is not a guess or late invention. It is supported by the oldest surviving Norse texts. Before the goat became a visitor in disguise during folk celebrations, he was part of a divine story that was retold in halls, around winter fires, and likely during Yule gatherings themselves. To understand the Julbock, we must now step into that myth, the story of Tanngrisnir and Tanngnjóstr, the goats whose power and fate played a central role in the development of Yule symbolism. Chapter 2. Thor's Goat Companions, Tanngrisnir and Tanngnjóstr. To understand why the goat became an enduring symbol of Yule, we have to return to one of the clearest, best attested elements of Norse mythology: the two goats that pulled Thor's chariot. Their names are recorded in the Prose Edda, specifically in the section called Gylfaginning. The names are Tanngrisnir, meaning teeth-bearer or snarler, and Tanngnjóstr, meaning teeth grinder. These names suggest strength, tension, and physical force, traits that matched the god they served. Thor was a central figure to the Norse, not only as a warrior deity, but as a protector. He was believed to safeguard both gods and humans from threats, especially the giants who appeared throughout Norse myth. His movements across the sky during storms were interpreted as the rolling of his goat-drawn chariot. When thunder cracked, people imagined the power of these goats pulling their god through the clouds. The goats were more than symbolic draft animals. They were part of a myth that reflected the cycles of survival through winter. a cycle of killing, eating, and renewal. According to the prose Edda, Thor could slaughter his goats in the evening to provide food for himself and his companions. The bones would be collected carefully, and as long as no bone was broken, Thor could place them in the skins and resurrect the goats the next morning. This detail is important. It wasn't simply a narrative flourish. It mirrors real concerns in Norse life about sustaining resources through the winter and respecting the limits of what could be consumed. The resurrection of the goats meant that Thor always carried a renewable food source during long journeys. This myth would have resonated strongly with people living in an environment where winter could destroy entire herds. The idea of an animal that could be eaten and then brought back, intact and revived, expressed a wish for continuity that ordinary families lacked. Livestock was survival. If a family lost a goat or cow at the wrong time of year, the consequences could be severe. Descriptions of Thor's goats were also practical in tone. The tales emphasize the importance of not breaking the bones, a rule that aligns with the attention farmers paid to animal remains during slaughter. The process needed care and respect. A mistake could affect the outcome. In the myth, breaking a bone disrupts the resurrection cycle, a detail that will become relevant when Loki enters the story. It is reasonable to think that listeners during the Viking Age took these details seriously. The survival of the myth itself, carried into written form centuries later, suggests that the role of the goats held symbolic weight. They were powerful, dependable, and essential to the god who protected humanity. As Thor traveled with his goats, the image of a chariot pulled by strong animals would have been familiar. Many Norse communities used sledges or carts in winter, and livestock was routinely harnessed for transport. Seeing a divine version of this practice reinforced a connection between daily life and mythic understanding. In the context of Yule, when communities were focused on hardship, scarcity, and renewal, the goats represented an ideal form of resilience. They could be consumed for sustenance, yet still return, something humans could only hope for through successful rituals, careful planning, and the fortune that might come from the gods. Thor's goats were also seen as a reminder of responsibility. The myth establishes clear boundaries. The animals provided a benefit, but only if treated with care and respect. When that boundary is crossed, the consequences are immediate. This theme sets the stage for Loki's involvement, where a seemingly minor act leads to a significant outcome. In storytelling settings, especially during midwinter gatherings, this myth would have carried practical messages alongside entertainment. It reinforced the idea that survival required discipline. It also explained why goats, among all animals, were connected to Yule rituals. They were companions of a god who stood at the boundary between danger and protection, winter hardship and endurance. As we move further into the story, the importance of these goats becomes more apparent. A single journey, undertaken by Thor and accompanied by Loki, would alter the goats and leave a mark on tradition. That moment, recorded clearly in Norse texts, would later echo into folk practices that continued long after belief in the gods themselves faded. Chapter 3. Loki's Mischief. The bone that broke the midwinter peace. The story of the Yule Goat cannot be separated from the single moment in Norse myth where Thor's goats are harmed. Not by an enemy, not by a giant, but through a mixture of human error and Loki's influence. This event is recorded plainly in the prose Edda, making it one of the most secure pieces of evidence in the relationship between Thor, his goats, and the themes that would echo into later traditions. The journey begins with Thor and Loki traveling through the countryside. These travels appear regularly in Norse stories, and they often place Thor in direct contact with the daily lives of farmers, herders, and rural families. These encounters bridge myth and reality, reminding listeners that gods were imagined as active presences in the natural world, especially in times of difficulty. As night approached, Thor and Loki sought shelter. They came upon the home of a farmer who lived with his wife and 2 children, a son named Thjalfi and a daughter named Röskva. The household welcomed the travelers, as hospitality was an essential part of Norse culture. Turning strangers away in winter was dangerous, and hosting guests was considered both an obligation and the source of honor. It is likely that this myth was told in part to reinforce the importance of hospitality during the Yule season, when travelers could easily be caught in harsh conditions. Inside the farmhouse, Thor prepared a meal for everyone. He slaughtered his own goats, as he was known to do on long journeys, and cooked the meat for the household to share. Before eating began, Thor gave a clear instruction. No one was to break the bones. The bones were to be placed on the goat skins in the correct arrangement once the meat had been consumed. This rule was not arbitrary. It was essential for the goat's resurrection the following morning. Loki, whose presence in the story is consistent with his role in many Norse myths, interacted with the family. His behavior in this context aligns with his established character: clever, persuasive, and often driven by impulse rather than long-term consideration. He encouraged Thjalfi, the young son, to crack one of the bones to reach the marrow, a desirable part of the meat, rich in nutrients. Eating marrow would have been a practical temptation, especially in a setting where food scarcity was always a concern. Loki's suggestion therefore landed in a believable way, even within the mythic framework. Thjalfi broke the bone. According to the myth, this action seemed small in the moment. The meal continued. The family slept. Loki had introduced a transgression that would only reveal its consequence the next morning. At dawn, Thor rose and prepared to resurrect his goats. He placed the bones on the skins, raised his hammer, and brought life back to the animals. This was an established pattern in the myths, so the expectation was that the goats would return to their full strength. But this time, one of the goats stepped forward with a lamed leg. The injury reflected the bone that had been broken the night before. In Norse culture, livestock injuries were serious matters. a lame animal could lose its usefulness. For a god, whose goats were not just transport, but part of his identity and his power, the injury represented a notable violation of trust. Thor's reaction was predictable: anger. The prose Edda describes him gripping his hammer with such force that the entire household feared for their lives. Gods in the Norse worldview were not distant or abstract. They had direct emotional responses and the power to act on them. Once the truth was revealed, that Thjalfi had broken a bone at Loki's urging, Thor demanded compensation. Rather than harming the family, he accepted something else: the service of the two children. Thjalfi and Röskva became Thor's human companions, traveling with him in later stories and serving as part of his household. Their inclusion in the myth demonstrates how Thor focused his anger on the violation, not on indiscriminate punishment. The solution preserved the family and re-established balance. This moment, the injury to the goat, is the only recorded incident where Thor's goats fail to return to their perfect form after resurrection. It is therefore significant within the mythology. It establishes the goats as vulnerable yet powerful, capable of renewal but dependent on respectful behavior. This tension would later reflect the role of the Yule Goat in folklore, a figure who rewards proper conduct and marks failures, a visitor who inspects homes and traditions, and a reminder of what happens when ritual boundaries are ignored. Loki's involvement is equally important. His behavior illustrates one of the consistent themes in Norse myth. Small acts can alter outcomes dramatically. Loki did not attack the goats directly. He influenced a human to cross a boundary, and the resulting consequence extended to divine beings. This dynamic mirrors the fragile balance families faced during winter. A single mistake in food storage, fire tending, or livestock care could bring lasting hardship. The myth also shows Thor's relationship to ordinary households. He shared a meal with them. He expected them to follow instructions with care, and when things went wrong, he demanded restitution, not destruction. This interaction between god and household reflects why goats, associated so closely with Thor, entered domestic and seasonal traditions. This chapter marks the turning point in the goat story, the moment when myth meets consequence. From here, cultural memory would blend divine symbolism with the practical realities of midwinter life, shaping a tradition in which the goat becomes both helper and inspector. Chapter 4: The Wounded Goat and the Birth of a Legend. The incident at the farmer's home, the broken bone, the lamed goat, and Thor's anger, marks the only known moment in Norse myth where the goats suffer lasting harm. Because this moment is unique and clearly recorded, it holds particular weight. When examining how the Yule Goat later became a figure of midwinter folklore, this myth stands out as a foundational element. It is the earliest narrative that ties goats, winter travel, household conduct, and divine expectations together. After the resurrection, when the goat stepped forward with its injured leg, Thor saw immediately what had happened. The myth emphasizes not only his anger, but the seriousness of the violation. Thor depended on these animals for travel and sustenance. Their ability to return to full strength after each meal was part of what made him capable of moving through the world as a protector. A damaged goat represented more than an inconvenience. It reflected a breach of order, a failure to respect the rules that governed survival. The consequences were resolved through the offering of Thjalfi and Röskva as Thor's new servants. This act reinforced several ideas important in Norse culture: the need for accountability, the seriousness of broken agreements, and the willingness of individuals to accept responsibility for their actions. The children's service also symbolized a form of renewal. Something had been taken, the goat's perfect strength, and something was given in return. This fitted the Norse world view, which often linked balance and exchange. Once Thor and Loki continued their journey with the children, the myth leaves the injured goat behind. We do not receive further detail about its long-term condition, or whether it eventually regained its strength. But the absence of resolution is itself meaningful. The myth provides enough detail to establish the consequence, but does not soften it with a clear restoration. The injury remains part of the narrative, suggesting a lesson about the lasting effects of carelessness and the importance of following established rules. For communities living during the Viking Age, this story likely resonated during winter storytelling. The association between broken rules and physical consequences had practical parallels. A poorly repaired roof, left cracked before winter, could lead to flooding or cold damage. A broken tool that was not fixed properly could fail at a crucial moment. Livestock injuries could cost a family its livelihood. In this way, the myth served a dual purpose: entertainment and reinforcement of communal norms. It is in this intersection, myth shaping behavior and behavior reflecting myth, that the Yule Goat tradition begins to form. The memory of Thor's goats became more than a mythic detail. It influenced how goats were viewed symbolically during Yule. Their resilience, their central role in a story about hospitality and responsibility, and the connection to winter travel made them fitting symbols for a season focused on both survival and celebration. Another significant point in this myth is the role of Loki. His involvement shows how easily routines can be disrupted and how external influences, whether visitors, mischief makers, or unexpected events, can alter outcomes in the harshest season. Loki's suggestion to the boy was small but impactful. This mirrored the fragility of winter stability. Even a minor mistake could stretch into long-term problems. Over time, as Norse religion shifted and Christianization took hold in Scandinavia, many older myths were reinterpreted or adapted into local custom. Thor remained a remembered and respected figure long after open worship ended. Stories about him persisted in rural communities, especially those tied to weather, storms, and protection. His goats, therefore, also survived in cultural memory, gradually blending into rituals and performances during Yule. One logical link is that the goats' resilience and connection to food made them fitting symbols for Yule feasting. Another is that their association with Thor, a god who protected humans, contributed to their role as a visiting figure checking on households. A spirit with goat characteristics, inspired by the myth, became a recognizable presence during Yule-related customs. In some regions, the idea that the Yule Goat inspected homes may have reflected the theme of accountability found in the myth. Just as Thor expected the farmer's family to follow instructions accurately, the Yule Goat in folklore was imagined as a figure who assessed whether households had prepared appropriately for Yule. The injury of the goat might also have played a subtle role in the goat's later character in folklore. While not directly referenced, the idea of a goat that had been harmed because someone broke tradition could have made the Yule Goat a guardian figure. In folklore, guardian spirits often emerge from stories involving damaged or endangered beings who later take on roles of vigilance. The exact path from myth to folklore is difficult to trace because written records of folk practices appear much later. But what can be said with confidence is this: the myth of Thor's goats, especially the story of the broken bone, is the earliest strand that connects the animal directly to themes of winter conduct, household ritual, and midwinter gatherings. As storytelling passed from generation to generation, associations built on this foundation took shape in seasonal customs. By the time these customs appear in historical records, the goat had already taken on multiple symbolic roles during Yule. The details of those roles, whether as a visitor, an enforcer of tradition, or a bringer of gifts, evolved across regions. But they share a common thread that originates in the myth we've just explored. Chapter 5. From Myth to Hearth: How Thor's Goats Became the Julbock. The transition from Thor's mythic goats to the Yule Goat of Scandinavian folklore did not happen in a single moment, nor is there one written account that explains the shift directly. Instead, the evolution took place across centuries, carried through oral tradition, local customs, and the gradual blending of older beliefs with later practices. What we can trace with confidence is the pattern. Themes found in the myth of Thor's goats reappear in Yule customs, adapted to the realities of rural life. After the Scandinavian conversion to Christianity, elements of Norse belief persisted quietly. This was especially true in isolated regions, where farming communities held on to seasonal practices that had existed long before the new religion arrived. Yule remained a significant event, and many traditions connected to it continued under the surface of a Christian calendar. In these communities, the goat emerged as one of the enduring symbols of the season. Several factors make Thor's goats the most plausible root of the Julbock tradition. First, there is the association with midwinter travel. Thor's journeys through winter storms aligned with the dangers families faced during the season. A symbolic figure connected to such a deity would have remained relevant. Second, the goat's role in providing food ties directly into Yule feasts, where communities relied on preserved meats and livestock to survive the cold months. A goat that could be eaten, yet return to life, would have represented an ideal source of abundance. Third, the theme of inspection and accountability, present in the myth through Thor's reaction to the broken bone, resonates with later folklore describing the Yule Goat as a figure who checked that households prepared properly for the season. The idea that a goat spirit or goat-masked visitor evaluated behavior is consistent with this earlier mythic expectation that rules must be followed for good outcomes. By the medieval period, goats had developed a notable presence in Yule customs. Written descriptions from later centuries document traditions in which individuals dressed in goat costumes visited homes during the season. These figures were known across Scandinavia under various local names, but shared core characteristics: a goat-like appearance, a tendency to demand recognition or offerings, and a role in ensuring that households observed traditional practices. The goat mask, or costume, often made from fur, wood, and horns, resembled a stylized version of an animal that carried both strength and unease. The visitor could act forcefully or playfully, depending on local custom. Sometimes, the goat figure entered homes to test whether residents had prepared enough food or drink for Yule. In other cases, it performed as part of a group of masked individuals who traveled between farms. These customs demonstrate how the symbolic goat moved from myth to physical presence. The goat was no longer simply a creature in a divine story. It was part of a ritual intended to unify communities, reinforce social expectations, and mark the transition into the new year. The physicality of the costume, heavy horns, noisy bells, and exaggerated features, also reflect the idea that the figure had both authority and unpredictability. The connection between Thor's goats and these masked traditions is strengthened by the fact that Yule, the Norse winter festival, continued to carry elements of older worship long after Christianization. Historical sources, including laws and clergy writings, indicate that certain pre-Christian customs persisted in rural areas. Some were discouraged openly, while others blended gradually into acceptable practices. The goat's endurance as a Yule symbol suggests that it had deep cultural roots, not easily replaced by new religious frameworks. Another important transition occurred as the goat moved from a figure associated with accountability to one associated with gift-giving. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Yule Goat appears in Scandinavian sources as a seasonal visitor who delivered presents to children. In some regions, the goat carried the gifts. In others, a man dressed as the Yule Goat performed the role. This reversal, from a figure that demanded offerings to one that provided them, indicates the adaptability of the tradition. There is no direct evidence that Thor's goats delivered gifts, but the association between gods and benefactors was a natural progression in communities that combined older stories with newer seasonal customs. Thor was a protective figure. Linking his goats to the act of bringing joy or good fortune during Yule aligned with the broader sense that midwinter required symbolic gestures of hope. As the goat entered homes in these customs, its symbolic presence strengthened. In many households, the goat became a sign of good luck, especially when represented by a straw figure. These small straw goats, often bound with red ribbon, were crafted from the final sheaf of the harvest. This practice connected agricultural success to winter symbolism. The final grain of the season carried into the home as a reminder of continuity, resilience, and the cycle of the year. The use of straw itself has practical and symbolic significance. Straw was an essential resource used for animal bedding, insulation, and crafts. The decision to form straw into the shape of a goat reinforced the animal's role in the household imagination. The straw goat was not a decorative invention. It reflected long-standing associations between goats, sustenance, and seasonal ritual. Over time, the Yule Goat tradition took slightly different forms across Scandinavia. In Sweden, the straw goat became especially prominent as a household symbol. In Norway, the Julbock procession emphasized masked visits. In Finland, the goat developed into joulupukki, a figure who blended older goat imagery with later gift-bringer characteristics, eventually influencing the region's version of Santa Claus. These varieties show how flexible the goat symbolism had become. Yet, despite regional differences, the central idea remained consistent. The goat was a guardian of winter households, a reminder of tradition, and a bridge between old myth and living practice. By tracing these developments, we see how the sacred goats of Thor gradually became the winter visitor known as the Julbock. The shift was not linear, but layered. Myth giving meaning to ritual, ritual giving structure to custom, and custom preserving memory long after the original stories had faded from daily belief. Chapter 6: Straw Goats, Masked Visits, and the Old Yule Customs. By the time written records began describing Scandinavian folk practices in detail, the Yule Goat had become an established part of midwinter customs. The transition from myth to folklore was complete. Thor's goats existed in stories, but the Julbock existed in people's actual lives. The evidence for these customs comes from regional histories, clergy reports, ethnographic notes, and 18th to 19th century documentation. What appears is a remarkably consistent tradition, even across different Scandinavian countries. One of the most recognizable elements was the goat mask or goat costume used in Yule processions. These processions, known by different names depending on region, including Julebukking, Julbock, or joulupukki, involved groups of young people traveling from house to house during the Yule season. In many places, the group included a figure who represented the goat. This person wore a mask carved from wood or shaped from bark, often painted or decorated with straw, fur, and real horns. The masks typically had exaggerated features: large eyes, long horns, and a striking expression meant to create a blend of humor and unease. The goat figure did not behave passively. Accounts describe the Julbock entering homes energetically, sometimes unpredictably. In some traditions, the goat tested the readiness of the household. He might knock on the door loudly, step inside without waiting for an invitation, or challenge the residents to acknowledge him. In other places, the goat acted mischievously, chasing members of the household in harmless play or demanding food and drink. These behaviors align with the themes found in earlier myth: inspection, boundary testing, and the presence of an external influence that disrupts normal order. The purpose of these visits varied. In some communities, the arrival of the Julbock was considered a good omen, a sign that the household had maintained proper custom. Offering food or drink to the goat figure upheld the sense of hospitality essential to the season. In certain regions, the goat's behavior leaned toward the theatrical. Participants acted out exaggerated scenes, including the goat collapsing and being revived, an echo, likely unconscious, of Thor's goats being slaughtered and resurrected in myth. Another major component of the Yule Goat tradition was the creation of straw goats, known especially in Sweden and parts of Finland. These figures were often crafted from the last sheaf of grain harvested during the year. Using the final sheaf was significant. In many agrarian societies, it was believed that the spirit of the harvest resided in the last crop gathered. Bringing the final sheaf into the home symbolized continuity and the hope of a successful harvest in the coming year. Shaping it into a goat expressed both practical respect for an important domesticated animal and symbolic acknowledgement of older associations tied to Thor. The straw goat was frequently placed near the hearth or hung from the rafters. Its role varied. In some places, it was meant to bring good fortune, and in others, it served as a reminder of the importance of the season. Families might keep the straw goat year-round, replacing it only after the next harvest. This created an unbroken cycle between agriculture, winter ritual, and household protection. There were also customs in which the straw goat appeared in less welcome form. In certain regions, neighbors would attempt to leave a straw goat secretly in another household's barn or house. If someone found the straw goat unexpectedly, they were expected to pass it on to another home, undetected, before the season ended. This practice may have developed from older ideas about the goat inspecting or judging households. More practically, it acted as a playful challenge between neighbors, maintaining social connections during a difficult season. In Norway, the joulupukki tradition often included singing. Groups would go door to door, performing Yule songs, sometimes in costume. The goat remained a central figure in these groups. In exchange for their performance, the visitors received food or drink, customarily leftovers from the Yule feast. The practice reinforced community ties and ensured that even isolated families participated in communal celebration. In Finland, the goat figure developed a distinct identity as joulupukki, the Yule Goat. Before merging with later Christmas traditions, joulupukki was not initially a benevolent character. Early descriptions portray him as rough in demeanor, demanding tribute rather than offering gifts. Over time, this figure softened and gradually took on characteristics of the Christmas gift-bringer, influenced by external traditions, but still rooted in the goat association. Throughout these customs, the goat retained traits consistent with its mythological origins: strength, assertiveness, and the role of an intermediary between households and the forces that governed the natural world. The goat did not appear as a passive creature or as a symbol of decoration. In both costume and straw form, it acted as a representation of resilience, continuity, and the expectations that came with winter. Importantly, these Yule Goat traditions remained active well into the 19th century and in some areas into the early 20th. Even as urbanization spread and new forms of Christmas celebration became dominant, the goat endured in rural regions. Straw goats continued to be made. Masked visits persisted. And the idea of the goat as a seasonal figure remained widely recognized. The persistence of these customs demonstrates how deeply the goat had become embedded in the cultural identity of Yule. It connected communities to their agricultural past, their mythic stories, and their need for shared ritual during the harshest part of the year. Chapter 7. The Goat Who Brought Gifts Before Santa Arrived. As the centuries progressed, the Yule Goat underwent another transition, one that shifted his role from a strict visitor or mischievous enforcer into a figure associated with generosity. This change did not occur suddenly or uniformly. It developed gradually through a combination of practical need, social custom, and the influence of new holiday traditions entering Northern Europe during the post-medieval period. What remained constant was the goat's connection to Yule and to the households that depended on winter rituals for structure and continuity. Early descriptions of the Yule Goat as a gift bringer come from the 18th and 19th centuries, although the roots of this shift are older. In many Scandinavian communities, households already expected visitors during Yule. Groups of masked youths, carolers, or neighbours who participated in joulupukki traditions. Over time, it became practical for one of these figures to carry small gifts or treats meant for children. The goat remained the most recognizable figure in these groups due to his established symbolic presence. In the regions where this development took hold, the Yule Goat did not replace the broader customs. Rather, gift-giving became an additional component. Children who encountered the Yule Goat might receive nuts, apples, woven crafts, or small toys. In some areas, these gifts were homemade. In others, they came from the household itself and were distributed through the goat figure for the sake of tradition. The result was a custom that blended existing ritual with emerging expectations for holiday celebration. The goat's earlier association with assessing households also lent itself to this new role. A visiting figure who previously tested whether the household had prepared for Yule could now reward families, especially children, when traditions were upheld. This transition made the goat more approachable and less intimidating. Yet some regional accounts still describe the Yule Goat as stern or unpredictable, even while giving gifts. The earlier traits associated with Thor's goats had not fully disappeared. Instead, they were softened by the new cultural emphasis on generosity. Finland provides the clearest example of how the Yule Goat transformed into a gift bringer with a long-lasting legacy. The Finnish joulupukki, originally a goat-like figure who demanded offerings, gradually adopted characteristics from the growing European tradition of a benevolent Christmas visitor. As outside influences spread through trade, religion, and printed material, joulupukki adapted. By the 19th century, Finnish descriptions of the figure show a noticeable shift. Instead of taking gifts, he delivered them. His appearance changed as well, eventually blending goat symbolism with human traits. This evolution eventually led to the modern portrayal of joulupukki, who resembles Santa Claus, but still carries the name and memory of the Yule Goat. This is one of the clearest examples in Scandinavia of a pre-Christian figure merging with a Christian holiday tradition, resulting in a hybrid character that preserved cultural continuity. In Sweden and Norway, the goat also appeared in gift-bringing contexts, but often in partnership with other figures. In some regions, the goat accompanied the person delivering gifts. In others, the goat performed the role alone. Traditional illustrations from the 19th century often depict a man wearing a goat mask or goat-themed costume, carrying a sack of presents. This indicates that the symbolic role of the goat had become flexible, able to incorporate new customs without losing its distinct identity. Even as the goat's role shifted toward giving, the original associations endured. The straw goat remained a common household decoration, especially when produced from the final sheaf of the harvest. Its placement near the tree, hearth, or entryway reinforced the connection between agricultural cycles and winter rituals. Households recognized the goat as a protective symbol, a reminder that Yule was both a celebration and a time requiring vigilance and preparation. In many cases, children were told that the Yule goat observed households throughout the season, confirming that preparations were complete. This mirrored older customs in which the goat inspected homes. Even though the outcome, gifts rather than warnings, had changed, the underlying idea remained the same. The goat's presence marked whether a household had respected tradition. The transformation of the Yule goat into a gift bringer also reflects broader changes in European holiday culture. As printed books, illustrations, and imported customs gained influence, symbols associated with Christmas adapted across regions. Yet Scandinavia preserved the goat more strongly than most cultures preserved their pre-Christian symbols. This demonstrates how deeply embedded the Julbock had become in Scandinavian identity. By the early 20th century, the Yule goat had become a familiar part of Christmas imagery. Straw goats were common decorations. Goat-themed cards circulated, and in some rural areas, masked goat visits continued. Even as modern Christmas influences spread, the goat remained visible, an old symbol that adapted without disappearing. The Yule goat's transition from mythic association to folk custom, and then to gift bringer, illustrates how traditions evolve in response to cultural needs. What began as a reminder of responsibility and resilience became a figure associated with goodwill. Yet the foundation, the connection to Thor's goats, to winter survival, and to Yule itself, never entirely faded. Chapter 8. The Yule Goat. Today, guardian of winter and ancient memory. The Yule Goat's survival into the modern era is unusual when compared to many other seasonal figures rooted in pre-Christian tradition. While most old symbols either faded or transformed beyond recognition, the Julbock remained visible throughout Scandinavia. Its endurance is supported by continued household practices, local customs, and cultural identity that values historical continuity. Today, the Yule Goat appears in several forms, each linked to the older traditions documented in historical records. One of the most widespread modern expressions of the Yule Goat is the straw goat, commonly found in Swedish homes during December. These straw figures are typically bound with red ribbon and placed near the Christmas tree, on shelves, or by the hearth. Their presence may seem decorative, but the straw goat's roots lie firmly in agricultural custom. The connection to the final sheaf of the harvest remains culturally recognized, even if the original symbolism is no longer widely discussed. The goat still represents the idea of continuity, prosperity, and the successful completion of the year's work. The straw goat also became part of public displays, the most well-known example being the Yule Goat, first erected in 1966 in the Swedish city of Gävle. Standing several meters tall, this straw structure was created as a symbol of the local holiday season. While modern in scale and presentation, it draws directly from the tradition of crafting straw goats. The Yule Goat has become internationally recognized, partly due to the frequent attempts to burn it down, an unintended but persistent tradition that echoes the historical connection between winter rituals and the symbolic destruction of old forms before renewal. In Finland, the legacy of the joulupukki remains strong. Although the modern Finnish joulupukki visually resembles Santa Claus, he retains distinctive regional traits. For example, he is often depicted as arriving from Korvatunturi in Lapland, rather than from the North Pole. A detail rooted in Finnish geography, not imported myth. More importantly, his name remains unchanged: Yule Goat. The goat origin is acknowledged in cultural memory and has not been replaced by alternate terminology. This continuity demonstrates how the figure evolved while preserving its original identity. In Norway and Denmark, the Yule Goat persists in rural traditions and festive displays. Small straw goats remain common decorations, and the association between the goat and midwinter rituals continues to hold cultural value. While masked goat visits have largely faded from modern practice, they survive in regional reenactments and educational programs focused on folklore. Across Scandinavia, the Yule Goat also appears in Christmas markets, folk museums, and seasonal festivals. These contexts present the goat as part of cultural heritage, highlighting its long history and its connection to pre-Christian customs. In many museum exhibits, the goat is explained in connection with both myth and agriculture, reflecting the blended foundation that shaped the tradition. The endurance of the Yule Goat is partly due to its adaptability. Whether as a symbolic guardian, a lively masked visitor, or a seasonal gift bringer, the goat filled roles that communities needed at different periods. During the mythic era, the goats of Thor highlighted themes of resilience and responsibility. During the folk custom era, the Julbock reinforced social bonds and seasonal expectations. In more recent centuries, the goat adopted a new role, connected to generosity and family celebration. Yet, through every shift, the goat remained tied to Yule, to winter, to ritual, and to the idea of protecting the household during the most challenging part of the year. Although some elements of the older customs have faded, the symbolism remains recognizable. The goat still represents a figure who enters the home, whether in physical form or simply as a decoration. He carries the memory of midwinter inspections and the expectation that households maintain tradition. Even in modern settings, people sometimes speak of the straw goat as a guardian figure, placed near the tree to watch over the home during the season. This belief, though not formally spelled out in historical texts, aligns with the goat's long-standing role as an observer and symbolic protector. The Yule Goat also serves as an accessible reminder of older Scandinavian heritage. While many mythological figures survive only in texts, the goat persists in living tradition. Because the goat is not tied to a single religious system in its modern form, it can be appreciated by people of any background. This flexibility allows the tradition to continue without conflict, preserving cultural history in a way that feels inclusive. Today, the Yule Goat stands at the intersection of myth, history, and modern celebration. He is the echo of Thor's companions, the figure who inspired fear and respect in Yule visitors centuries ago, and the familiar straw ornament found in homes around the world. His symbolism has shifted to match the needs of each era, but his presence has remained continuous. The Julbock endures because he represents more than a specific story. He embodies the qualities winter communities needed: resilience, protection, accountability, and tradition. In a season defined by darkness and cold, the Yule Goat served, and continues to serve, as a reminder that strength and continuity matter. Even as celebrations modernize, this figure holds his place, quietly anchoring the season to its oldest roots. Thank you for listening to this story of the Yule Goat. From Thor's mythic companions in the Prose Edda to the Julbock traditions that lived on in Scandinavian homes for centuries. The goat's journey from divine chariot puller to masked midwinter visitor to today's familiar straw figure shows how older beliefs can survive by adapting to each generation. Whether appearing in myth, folklore, or modern celebrations, the Yule Goat has always represented resilience, protection, and the customs that carry people through the hardest part of the year. I'm glad you joined me for this look into his history. Until next time, thank you for listening.